a Minuteman III nuclear missile re-enter the atmosphere. Of course, they have dummy warheads in them when you're shooting them at a target, a test target. But a few years later, I mentioned this to somebody who had actually been a nuclear weapons designer. I said to her, yeah, I was out in the Marshall Islands, and she knew exactly where that was because she was a nuclear weapons designer, retired from that now. By the way, a devoted Christian, interestingly enough. But she had been designing nuclear weapons as part of, while she was a Christian. And I said to her, I saw this enter the atmosphere and I saw, the streaks coming in, and I said to myself, wow, if that was real, the next thing is I'd be dead. And she looked at me and she said, that's right. And it's one of those things where you say, yeah, she's confident in her weapons abilities, I suppose. And the Marshall Islands are also going underwater from climate change. They're very, very low-lying atolls. They're one of 4 countries in the world that are likely to be completely destroyed by climate change. So when the average height of your country is only 6 feet out of the water, and it's only a couple feet above the high tide line when high tide is up, when the waves come in and sea level's already risen more than 8 inches, this becomes a serious problem. So in a few more years, the Marshall Islands are likely to become uninhabitable. And all these things are, of course, because of technology. Now, the Marshallese, people who live in the Marshall Islands, don't want to think about their country that way, right? They don't want to think about the fact that they've been used for nuclear testing, 10% of their country is still saturated in radiation, or the fact that their country is going to go underwater. They think about, this is life, this is a beautiful image of their country and lifestyle that they have there. But these are the sorts of things that are happening, whether they want it or not. It's being forced upon them by the way the world operates. And of course, this is a big problem for all of us because the Marshall Islands are kind of like the canary in the coal mine. That's the way I think of them. They're one of the first places that are experiencing some of the worst things that humankind can do to each other. So while I was out there, I prayed to God, God, make me do your work, because I knew I was lazy. Then it's a question of what work might that be? Well, I discovered I like teaching a lot. And also, this is kind of subconscious at the time. It's not something I realized until maybe a year, a decade later, maybe even, that technology was really what was making these problems happen. And so we need to control technology. Technology needs to be done in the right way. So I got a doctoral degree from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley with a dissertation on technology and human nature. All right. The very next week, I started at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. It took a few years, but then I became the director of technology ethics. So I started off there in kind of a lower position, teaching about technology and ethics. And eventually, the center director realized we need somebody working on technology ethics specifically. So I started publishing on existential risks, among other things. Of course, what is existential risk? If you're familiar with it, I'll just go through this part quickly, but there's obviously a pretty big literature on it. It was kind of launched by Nick Bostrom and some of his friends who were working on these sorts of things. So it's a risk that threatens human extinction or the permanent curtailing of human potential for the future. A global catastrophic risk is kind of a sub-level of risk. It's not quite as dangerous. It doesn't threaten extinction, but it's going to devastate large areas of the Earth's surface or kill large numbers of people, possibly destroying civilization. During my dissertation, one of my dissertation committee members always said, start with a bigger problem. And so that's what I decided to do, concentrate more on existential than global catastrophic. And this is just an image from Bostrom. All right, what are some examples? So there are natural risks and there are anthropogenic risks. If you read Toby Ord's book called The Precipice, which came out, I believe, just last year, it's a really, really good book on this subject. The natural risks are asteroids, supervolcanoes, pandemics, gamma ray bursts, nearby supernova, expansion of the sun, those sorts of things. Anthropogenic risks are actually much riskier, though. Nuclear war, AI, nanotechnology, environmental toxicity. People hardly ever talk about environmental toxicity, but it's actually a genuine problem. Engineered pandemics, and so on. All right. So then we get into the Christianity question. How does Christianity connect to all of this? And so we can look at some presumptions of how Christianity operates. God has a path for history culminating in the end of the world or the recreation of creation. God also has a role in history based on the prime example of Jesus entering into history, into our world. And so we might say to ourselves, it seems like Christians don't need to worry about threats to our survival because God has a plan and God is in charge. However, what I would say is that God has also given humans' freedom, including the freedom to sin grievously. And we've seen this, of course, throughout history, and the Bible, of course, exhibits this also. So humans are capable of causing immense evil. Past human-like species have gone extinct, and it's our duty to love our neighbor and care for each other, and therefore we should protect each other from harm, regardless of whether it's an X risk or not, right? Regardless of whether this is something that's going to cause extinction, we're still obligated to help each other. All right, and so the argument that I can make here is not an airtight case that God would allow a secular apocalypse where humans all kill each other, or that Christians could actually prevent this secular apocalypse. But what I can say for sure, 100%, is that we should care. We should try to stop these things from happening. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about the freedom that God's given us, of course. God permits a lot of bad things to happen because of the freedom that he's given us. Genocides, of course, have killed millions of people throughout history. Humankind has not shown what the limits are of our capacity for evil. And I'd say also, God has not shown that there are any limits to what God will allow. However, we can't know what we've been saved for. And it's possibly quite a bit. Who knows? You know, God may have prevented nuclear war countless times, or other sorts of disasters countless times. We would never know about it. This is one of the problems that we have talking about ethics with big companies or other places like that. They say, hey, how do we know that ethics has done anything? And the answer is, well, how many bad things have you avoided? It's very hard to say what bad things have not happened because you were being more ethical. We can maybe look at our own lives and our own decisions and figure that out, but it's hard to look at, you know, other people because we don't know what's going on internally in their minds unless they say something about it. So there's a little bit of fear here perhaps for God's character, because if these threats are real, does that impugn God's character? And I'd say no. Salvation is not of this earth. All the evil that happens here now is going to be corrected in the new heavens and the new earth. And also remember that Jesus was executed. Deicide is the ultimate crime. And God permitted humans to do it. Of course, we failed at it. It was an attempted deicide, and we failed. However, God allowed that thing to happen. So if God allowed that, it's hard to say that God won't allow human extinction, because, I mean, even if we fail, right? It's hard to say that God won't allow that to happen because he's allowed a, you know, technically worse thing to happen. But our salvation would still be possible, of course. Just as the resurrection was not exactly foreseeable, God could save humanity from existential risk, though it might not be in this world in a way that we expect, or God could choose to do that through acting through us, through our effort, which is where I say that the connection to effective altruism, I think, becomes really, really apparent. That this is something that we can be helping God. You know, we're basically, you know, this is what we're here for, right? So barring divine intervention, it's our role as God's children and friend to help fulfill God's mission and to limit evil as much as we can, including the worst evils of global catastrophic risks, mass destruction, mass death, and possible human extinction. All right. The Roman Catholic Church has a very interesting teaching that's come out in just the last couple decades. You know, just 12 years ago, Pope Benedict published an encyclical called Caritas et Veritate. And then Pope Francis reiterated that in 2015 in Laudato Si. So this has been two popes who have both stated this strongly. The work of the church seeks not only to remind everyone of the duty to care for nature, but at the same time, she must above all protect mankind from self-destruction. So this is very interesting. Both of these encyclicals had a strong environmental element to them. However, in this place, they say, look, even more so than that, of course we have to protect the environment, but we also have to recognize that humankind is at stake here, and we have to do something about this. And they say, look, this is the work of the church to make this happen. All right. I'm just going to go quickly through this because I assume you all know the Bible pretty well. It's full of disasters. History is brutal. Noah and the flood. If you take it literally, all humans are intentionally exterminated except for a few people on a boat, right? God permits a global catastrophe and also offers a way out, which is via technology, it should be noted. Now, of course, you don't have to take it literally to look at this same thing. Even if this story is a rationalization for rising sea levels after the Ice Age, the sentiment is still there. In the Bible, in biblical religion, extermination or near extermination is apparently a possibility. So we should allow for that. And of course, there are numerous other stories in the Bible where people are, and entire groups of people are targeted for extermination. Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. The Canaanites are targeted for extermination, and many of them are. And not to put all the violence in the past, but of course, the book of Revelation has violent images about the future, although, of course, that's very dependent on interpretation. All right, we can look at ancient history. One of the reasons I think the Catholic Church is particularly attuned to these ideas of disaster endangering humankind is because the Catholic Church, of course, lived through the fall of the Roman Empire. And of course, all Christians were, in a completely different format at the time. But I think that, Christians should really think about the history here. The collapse of civilization has happened before. Of course, life went on. Chaos reigned for centuries after that. It wasn't a great outcome, but one of the things that happened after that, of course, is that Christianity grew greatly. So God managed to bring good out of evil. And I'd say the Bible's not unusual in this, or ancient history is not unusual. All you have to do is look back to the Cold War. There are numerous near misses during the Cold War. I think there's something like 50 near misses where war almost happened, but then didn't. In the Cuban Missile Crisis itself, there were no fewer than 4 incidents where nuclear weapons were almost used. Lots of people know about Vasily Arkhipov, who was a submarine captain at the time, and the other people in his crew wanted to use nuclear weapons. He said, no, we can't do that. There was another Russian submarine where that also happened. And there were several places where the United States almost initiated the nuclear war also, where the generals that Kennedy was working with said, hey, if the Russians cross this line, then we should just, all out nuclear war. We should do it. And those lines were crossed, and Kennedy said, no, we're not going to do it. So it came that close. Was it divine intervention? Maybe it was. We don't know. Maybe God, said or put something in, John F. Kennedy's head and said, hey, don't do it. We probably shouldn't count on it again, however. Whenever you have something good happen to you, it's good not to have to rely on that again. It would be better if you could solve it before you get into that situation in the first place. And just continuing on this, if you look at deep history, God has allowed several mass extinctions on Earth. Most species that have ever lived are now extinct. Extinction is common. And there have been multiple species in the genus Homo that have also gone extinct. So, for example, Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and the Homo floresiensis, who are also known as the Hobbit people, who are from the island of Flores in Indonesia, who tended to be about 3.5 feet tall, all extinct. And of course, another form of extinction is evolving into another species. We can't rule out that humans might go extinct by transforming into something else. This is an interesting image from Christianity Today that had an article on transhumanism. So evolution and replacement is common throughout history. There are lots of people out there who are actually working on this. Most don't advocate extermination, of course, of the quote-unquote mostly original substrate humans, which is something that Ray Kurzweil coined. But some people, there's a guy named Zoltan Istvan, who's here in California, have actually said, oh, transhumans are going to replace humans, and that's something we should be okay with. So obviously ethical problems with that. And of course, if we look far into the future, the Earth is going to be destroyed. The sun's going to expand, and at first the Earth is going to overheat between 500 and 1 billion years from now. And then likely about 5 billion years from now, the Earth is going to be engulfed by the sun. Now, these are not near, of course, but given current knowledge, they are going to happen. So the fourth point, our command is to love each other as followers of Christ. That is what he told us to do. That means wanting the best for all people. Human extinction is not in anybody's best interest. And things that fall short of extinction are still pretty bad. So I guess the more pragmatic argument that I'm making here is that if we defend against the worst outcomes, if we do that right, we'll actually also be defending against less bad outcomes. So in other words, bad outcomes short of the worst outcomes. So for example, global nuclear arms control might help prevent a regional nuclear war, which would itself be a terrible nuclear disaster. And there are, of course, more and more regional nuclear powers that are threatening to destabilize balances of power right now. So attempts to prevent X-risk level malicious AI, for example, will likely also prevent other less dramatic AI mishaps also. Sometimes people see these competing with each other. I think that alignment, for example, when you're talking about bias or fairness in AI, which is a very important contemporary AI question, I think that leads directly to advances in unaligned malicious AI and those sorts of things. All right. So we're commanded to love everyone as God loves, no matter what, even our enemies. Allowing extinction would be the ultimate dereliction of the duty to love each other. And so X risks should absolutely be avoided, and avoiding them will bring benefit even if God would have otherwise protected humankind. So that's my conclusion, basically saying these are conceptually real, they're theologically possible. I think that's the strongest thing I can argue for, is that it's possible. If God is protecting us against X risks, then working against them still brings temporal and eternal benefits short of preventing the X risk itself, because it's still following the commandment to love. It makes us better people, and it helps the world in other ways as well. Our duty to love should scale with humanity. We should try to see the world as God sees it, with billions of people to love, care for, and protect now and in the future. So that's all I have. Thank you very much. I love answering questions, so please ask me questions. Let's see. I just want to see how many people are in the room right now. We got 24 people here. So if you want to go ahead and put something into Slido, or if you want to put something into the chat, then that would be great. I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Brian. That was really helpful, and I'm sure there's loads more to discuss. There are a few questions on the Slido. So what's the best way of doing this? I could read them out, but if I start reading your question and you want to jump in and explain a bit more or rephrase it, then please just unmute yourself and do so. But otherwise, I'll just start with those at the top. So firstly, even if humans have the freedom to sin grievously, should Christians be at least less concerned about X risk compared to secular EAs? So, for example, because of biblical end times, and that including people.
So that's a really interesting question. Relatively speaking, should we be less concerned than secular EAs? So I don't think we should be less concerned, but perhaps differently concerned would be the way I would describe it. For secular EAs, it's really the end, right? They don't have any afterlife that they're thinking about. They don't have judgment, death, heaven, and hell, the four last things to think about. So instead, they're looking at it in perhaps in a more absolute or final respect. But I think that for us, it's still as important of a concern. It's just a slightly different one in this case, because actually our eternal soul is at stake also, right? It's not just the status of the world. It's also us and also our friends and other people we know, right? There's a lot at stake here besides just temporal reality. There's also eternal reality that's at stake. But it's different kind of stakes, right? So this is really an interesting question. I'd have to think about it a little more, and actually this would be a great topic of longer discussion. So, my email's right there. If you want to email me, I'd love to talk more about that.
Thanks, Brian. And if whoever asked that question, if you want to jump in and ask for any clarifications, please do. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next one. So someone has asked, Dominic Roser argued that long-termism, if stretched too far in time, is presumptuous. Then where is the line? Decades, centuries, question mark. I don't know who asked that. Do you want to maybe explain what Dominic means by presumptuous there? Unless, Brian, you happen to have read the same article.
No, I'm not familiar with it. Sorry.
I feel like it's going to be hard to answer that one unless we know what Dominic's argument was there. So I don't know if you want to unmute and explain that. All I can see is anonymous.
So if you do want to jump in, please do. I'll try to answer that. Perhaps this is my assumption of maybe what he says is going on there. Presumptuous, perhaps thinking that history is eternal, right? There's a limit to history is something that's a standard Christian belief, right? And thinking beyond centuries or decades perhaps gets into the presumptuous territory. What I would say is it's been 2,000 years since Jesus said the end is near, right? If you look at that in the scale of deep time and the universe being 13 billion years old, 2,000 years is still pretty short. So I think, from God's perspective, the end is still near. The question is it still thousands of years in the future, or is it still only decades in the future? There's no way to know, right? Because nobody knows the day or the hour. This is, standard Christian stuff. I don't think we need to argue past the decades or centuries level to be concerned about existential risk. Existential risk is something that we've been living with now ever since the invention of the hydrogen bomb back in the 1950s. And, possibly existential risk from nuclear war peaked in about 1960s, early 1970s. But there's still, over 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world, closer to, I think, 15,000. And that's assuming everybody's obeying the treaties, right? There could be a whole bunch that we don't know about that are secret. And that's still more than enough to absolutely ruin the world. So we don't need to think far into the future. We could be thinking, right now. And I think a lot of people forget the kind of urgency that this situation has that we're living in right now.
Great, thanks, Brian. So a more practical question, given that only a few people will ever be in a position to launch a nuclear missile, thankfully, what can the average person do to avoid X risks?
So there are two strategies, right? You can either try to reduce the danger of the risk happening, or you can try to take measures to adapt to the risk if you don't think the risk can be mitigated adequately. So the two terms, these come from climate change literature. There's mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means you try to reduce the risk, and adaptation means you try to increase your resilience for the part that you can't mitigate against. I've written 2 papers with a Russian scholar, Alexei Turchin, on some of the adaptations that can be taken against X risks. We talked about using submarines and also islands as refuges from disaster. And of course, there's outer space as an option too. There's seasteading, there's Antarctic shelters. There's all different kinds of ways you can shelter against these sorts of risks to make them non-existential, right? They just become global catastrophic if there are still a few people who still live. Global catastrophic is terrible, and we should not be allowing that to happen. But if there's a non-mitigatable part of that risk, then the adaptation is the next level. And of course, people like Elon Musk are doing those sorts of things. So the adaptation side is something that I think people can work on. There are actually a lot of opportunities there, and I don't think they've been fully explored. The mitigation side, of course, is much preferable. Let's not have the terrible thing happen in the first place. And those sorts of things are difficult, yes. But I think that the EA movement actually has been fairly good at, first of all, reminding people that these problems exist, and second of all, that we can do something about it. And especially the ones that are not appreciated, right? The ones that are kind of underrepresented in terms of having work done on them. And I think that the pandemic that we're experiencing right now has also kind of pointed out that there are these risks out there that we can prepare for personally, but also we need to recognize that we have power, especially if we get into government, or if we get working with corporations, or if we get involved in political movements or ethical movements like EA is, and just get people, first of all, raise awareness, and then actually get some action taken. And a lot of people think that, it's politicians, it's just the president of the United States, or it's just a few other people who have this power here, but it's not. There are a lot of people, what would I say? When Donald Trump was elected, I was not a fan of Donald Trump. I was opposed to him. And then, as soon as he was elected, I said, all right, now is the time for the bureaucracy to become very intransigent, right? So whenever, something bad tries to happen, all you have to do is start dragging your feet if you're a bureaucrat. Now, the bureaucracy managed to handle that for 4 years to a certain extent. If it had gone on for 8 years, it would have been even worse. And it's no telling how much more damage could have been done. But there are ways to do things that are effective and can cause benefit, even if perhaps you weren't expecting your position to be as powerful as it is. Never underestimate the power of passive aggressiveness. This is something else I learned from being on a small island in the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. And in a small island culture, you can't be aggressive towards other people because you end up, bad things happen. People kill you. You can't do those sorts of things. So instead, you become passive aggressive and intransigent. And somebody says, "Hey, will you do this for me?" And you say, "Oh, of course we'll do that for you." And then it doesn't happen. And then you say, "Hey, will you do this for me?" And they say, of course, we're working on it." And then it doesn't happen. And so after a while, you realize, oh, I should probably stop asking. The person just doesn't want to do it. Anyway, there are interesting strategies to do other sorts of things, and actually can be quite effective.
Thanks, Brian. This is an interesting question, which I think relates to Ed's comment in the chat as well. So some Christians seem to desire near X risk scenarios as bringing about the second coming. So should we be worried that avoiding X risks might slow God's plans? And I guess like related to that idea is, does it just change our normative judgment of X risks if we know that God like intends for humans for the world to end anyway? Like if you see history as having an endpoint and that being a good thing, does that change your normative assessment of how bad X risks are?
So first of all, humans aren't supposed to be ending the world, right? That's God's prerogative. If you think that humans are supposed to do that, then you're actually evil. So, I think it's pretty clear that that's the case. So don't go and do that, or don't let your friends do that. If you see any other Christians saying that, tell them that they're actually being satanic. And that's clearly the word for it, right? This is satanic stuff where you're trying to kill humanity. That is not what humans are supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be loving each other and helping each other. Loving each other does not involve violence or killing or trying to bring about the end of the world. God, if anything, God has been merciful by giving us more and more time to work with, right? God's goal is to save everyone, to have everyone hear the message, and then try to help everybody, try to work for everyone's eternal salvation, and also help everyone temporally. Also, I mean, there's a reason that hospitals, Jesus had a healing ministry, Jesus had a teaching ministry. There's a reason that Christians have hospitals and schools. It's very different than if Jesus had a killing ministry and gone around killing people. That would have been a very different outcome for Christianity. Of course, it wouldn't have been Christianity at all. It would have been a very different religion. So anybody who's trying to do that with Christianity and say, hey, we're supposed to be bringing about the end of the world because it's part of God's plan, is not working on God's side. I think it's pretty clear that they're working on the side of the enemy because, Jesus never said, go out there and cause the end of the world.
Thanks. Right. Yeah, that's really helpful. Also, Adam's comment in the slide there, I don't know if you can see it, about how, I think a lot of theologians, including N.T. Wright, would describe it as less God saving people from the earth in order to destroy it, but more God bringing heaven and earth together in a new creation.
Right.
Which is obviously a more positive way of looking at it.
Yes.
Probably got time for one more. The question from Cuba. Cuba, feel free to jump in if I've not expressed it fully. Would you agree that Christians have stronger reasons to fight anthropogenic risks than natural ones?
So that's an interesting question. Natural risks, I think, turn out to be very low on the risk scale, right? Natural risks, say a super volcano, for example, a super volcano could ruin civilization. It's not likely to drive humankind extinct. And I guess my clarification there might be, would you see God operating in the natural risk? Is that kind of the question that's going on here?
Well, not necessarily. The question
Okay.
is about the reasons for. I mean, I wouldn't say that God necessarily brings the asteroids to end the Earth.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So I think that in that case, with that clarification, thank you. What I would say is that I think that Christians should be more interested in anthropogenic risks because they're higher risk. And because they're higher risk, therefore they have higher priorities. You should probably prioritize by what you think is the most dangerous. So, for example, malicious AI, I think is going to be a real problem in the future. It's going to be not so much that I think it's going to be, somebody says make paperclips and it tries to turn the entire world into paperclips. That's kind of an absurd choice. But instead, it's going to be something like a country saying, hey, how do we take over the world? And the AI is going to give them a plan. It says, oh, you can totally do it if you just first strike these places around the world and, secretly build up your arsenal over here. And then they start following that plan. And then they do it. But of course, the plan has a mistake in it. And there's either, nuclear retaliation or whatever it is. And then that ends up killing everybody. So I think the anthropogenic risks are higher priority just because they're more likely to happen.
So we probably have time just for one more before our break. I've lost my tab. So I think this is an interesting question. To what extent has past research on global pandemic risk helped during the COVID crisis? should we just optimize for solving X risks as and when they arise? So I guess this is a question about like predictability of X risks, and if they're unpredictable, then is it worth devoting time to specific things?
So it turns out that they're not that unpredictable, I would say. There is a huge amount of research on pandemics that became useful with the COVID pandemic, and a lot of that, the mRNA vaccines, for example, the mRNA vaccines were developed for the original SARS as a potential solution to that. And of course, now we know mRNA vaccines are actually fantastic. They're quite effective, and they're fast to produce. You can change them quickly if necessary. The question is deployment. How do we do rollout, right? So we're going to have to probably have these large infrastructure of vaccine production that we hold on to as we go into the future, because these pandemics are likely to become worse as we go forward. This is, if you look at COVID, it's actually kind of on the low side of the danger of pandemics. It's things are likely to get worse. It's actually kind of a miracle that we haven't had such a huge pandemic in over 100 years. So I would say they're not that unpredictable. We actually have a lot of information of what can happen. Let me rephrase that. They're not unpredictable in the generalities, they're unpredictable in the specifics. So if you prepare for them in general, of course, that's going to help you a lot more when the specific problem comes around. And so if you prepare for the general case, then you'll be more prepared for the specific case. That's the argument that I would make there. And I think we're probably out of time now.
Yeah, perfect. Great. So Brian, you're happy for people to email you if they have any further questions or follow up?
I think this is, I love talking about this. I love working with people on this. So if you want to email me, please do. Thank you very much for letting me speak. This has been a great opportunity, and it's been so great to get to see some of you.
Awesome. Great. We have a break now, so feel free to take a break from the screen or to meet other people on Gather. And then I think we reconvene in 10 minutes or so for the keynote talk.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.